the best way to start this is to take you back to summer of 2018 when I took on my role as the chief executive of the, then called Food Storage Distribution Federation, Cold Chain Federation in the UK. And I was in my first CEO job. I didn't know anything about temperature control, didn't know anything about supply chains, didn't know anything about vehicles, didn't know anything about warehousing or anything like that. But we did get a call that week from the BBC saying, is it true that retailers are stockpiling food in anticipation of the crises at the end of the year of Brexit, related to Brexit and the Brexit negotiations? And I had to make some stuff up on the spot. I didn't really know anything about the issue at that point, but we sort of started talking about it. And we didn't stop talking about crises and issues around getting food from farm to fork for 5 years. And we went through the political dramas of the Brexit negotiations, which had fundamental implications for supply chain in the UK because of that. And then obviously we then had COVID. And through COVID, we saw both the reaction and the disruption and the way that you have to adapt supply chains in the food supply chain sector with surges in parts of the market and declines in others. And then we also saw the miracle that was the distribution of the vaccine. And I think that what we get from that period of crisis, was a real understanding of why the bit in the middle really matters. And that's where I think I developed my passion, I think, for what this is about, and why I'm so delighted that I'm now able to talk about this, not just in the UK context, but from the point of view of the world, which sounds so grand and ridiculous. But basically, there are some big themes in there that I want to talk to you about today. And actually, whilst we were talking about COVID, and we were talking about vaccines, and we were talking about food supply chain emergencies, what we weren't talking about as much, or at least we weren't talking about as in the front page of the newspapers, was the real crisis or the real challenge and opportunity of the next generation of our supply chains, which is the whole issue of climate change and the whole issue of sustainability, and how we are going to adapt and deliver our food in the next 50 years, because we can't do it in the way we've done it in the last 50. And that's really the theme of the next few years of our discussions with yourselves as innovators in this room and with governments and others about the future of cold chain. So that's the title, the grand title of my presentation, Future of Cold Chain, Farm to Fork in a Decarbonised World, and that's me. It's an American company, so everyone's a vice president of something. I'm the senior vice president. And so the Global Cold Chain Alliance is, as Tim described, the international organization representing temperature-controlled supply chain. We're actually made up of 3 entities, the Global Cold Chain Alliance, which is the trade body. We also have the Charitable Foundation, and we also have within our family the Controlled Environment Building Association, which especially represents the businesses that build cold storage facilities. Well, temperature-controlled facilities or controlled environment facilities, because it's not just about keeping stuff cold. Sometimes it's about keeping stuff warm. We have more than 1,500 member companies in 92 countries around the world, and more than 50% of that is outside of North America. We keep saying that because most of the time GCCA speaks with an American accent. We try to remind people that we're not just about America. And we have offices in Africa, Brazil, Europe, India, and in Latin America. So what's the global challenge then? Let's talk about 3 threes. Firstly, we know this, in 70 years, in the lifetime of my parents, the global population has tripled. And we've had to scale up in our operations to be able to feed 3 times as many people on this planet than we had 70 years ago. We've increased the amount of land we use for agricultural production by 1/3 globally, both in agriculture. We heard a lot about that this morning, so I'm not going to dwell on that. And crucially, we waste 1/3 of the food that we produce. So 1/3 of the inputs that go into producing food across the world is wasted. Now, crucially, there is a developing south, a global south and a global north characteristic to that. In the global north, we've got a very sophisticated way of getting stuff out of the ground and getting it to the end consumer. And then we are very wasteful with it. We throw a lot of it away. In the global south, there are real challenges getting the product from the farm to the consumer, and the consumer wastes pretty much nothing. And so that distinction and that challenge plays out in how we think about our supply chains. And I guess when the Global Cold Chain Alliance is thinking about the biggest single job we have to do is about getting cold chain built in places in the world where we don't have it. Because a lot of the economic prosperity that we need as a society comes from being able to feed ourselves. I think we heard that this morning. And so we need to find a way of getting that product and not wasting it. And hopefully trying to use less land and trying to sort of control our growing population and affluence. In that context, the cold chain has to be seen in terms of this good guys, bad guys equilibrium. We are absolutely, and I will defend this every day, it's my sort of first job, cold chain is a force for good in the world. It is the way, it is the only way that we prevent and reduce post-harvest food losses. But of course, in doing that job, we can, and if we do it in the wrong ways, or we do it in the ways we've done it before, in the last 70 years, we generate a lot of CO2 emissions from those operations. And we have to find a way of delivering in a new way to sort of make sure that equilibrium works for the future. And this is the crucial point. As the world gets richer, as that population grows, as we think about and Tim Fox has written some really interesting papers very recently on the idea of feeding in a warming world, in a 50 degrees C world, the amount of cooling we're going to need, the amount of mechanical engineering to cool both the space that we stand in, but also the food and goods that we transport, will treble, and potentially double in emissions. We're talking about a very, very large contributor to our carbon emissions when you aggregate it all together. And that's why it's a key theme of the UN COP coalition. I will be in Dubai in 2 weeks' time, and we'll be talking about this in its own pavilion at the UN COP meeting, talking about the issues around cooling and how the world can come together to reduce our emissions from cooling. And as I've already made this point, but just to illustrate it, we are talking about a cold chain that is about parallel worlds, doing essentially the same job, but very, very, very different technological advancements. So you'll see the global north and the global south broadly characterized as is set out in this slide. And actually, so the innovation curve we have to go on as businesses, as innovators else, has to meet the change in the needs of these two different types of chain. And it's not as simple as we take what we did in the top half of that picture and do it in the bottom. Actually, we need to do things in different ways in the bottom. And the things we learn from doing that, we have to apply in the north. So the rest of this presentation, the rest of this talk is really about this essay question. How do we preserve more of the food we produce whilst using less fossil fuel-powered energy globally? It's quite a simple question, but obviously it comes with huge complexity. And I'm only going to talk about it. First I'm going to talk about it in terms of the innovations, and there's some speakers coming after me who can talk a lot more about the detail about some examples of this. When it comes to vehicles, obviously, like all businesses across the transportation supply chain, we're looking at electrification, and we're seeing across the world, and I'm thinking now particularly about what I know best in Europe and the West, we're seeing a kind of big ambition, but also a significant political kind of backwards and forwards on this. So we've recently in the UK seen a change in the deadlines for the phase out of diesel vans and cars. There are huge infrastructure questions to play out about that, particularly when it comes to food supply chain and haulage operations. What are the infrastructure needs to be able to actually transition away from using what we've got so used to using to power our vehicles? And when we think about the vehicles, often we jump immediately to some really exciting looking vehicles, and we've seen some great examples of huge pace of change in that space. We don't often always think about what does that mean in terms of the type of supply chain I can operate. Where do I need to locate my buildings? What do I need to do in terms of moving stuff around? But I think it's an optimistic picture, particularly with the smaller vehicles. We are at the point now where it is genuinely possible and actually happening that we are running supply chain operations with small vehicles and vans around our cities and around the UK and other parts of the West. When it comes to the heavy haulage sector, it's still a long way to go, but we are seeing that movement. So really what we're talking about is the early stages of a really quite fast adoption curve and lots of reasons to be optimistic. Now, I'm not going to talk about this very much because Alice is about to speak, and I've literally got his product there in my image. But one of the crucial things when you think about cold chain is actually when we talk about transportation and cold chain, we're not talking about one engine, we're talking about two, because there's an engine that powers the fridge. And the engine that powers the fridge has a significant number of requirements as well. And we have to think about how do we separate that out as a challenge, or do we treat it as one part of a whole with the vehicle? And there's lots of discussions and pros and cons either way. I think from a cold chain alliance point of view, we would say absolutely we should be thinking about how we decarbonize the fridge on its own innovation curve, separate to vehicles, particularly for the heavy haulage, because there are big gains to be learned and big things we can learn from adopting non-fossil fuel-powered solutions for the fridges that will translate into the behaviours and learnings we need for operating our vehicles in the end. And it is a gateway to that wider decarbonisation. And finally, modal shift. And actually, this is an area we don't talk about enough, really. And the fact that, whether it's the waterways of the UK and rivers and canal structure, or whether it's the railways that we have available to us, to what extent can we get vehicles off the road and actually be using those other modes? I have to say, when it comes to fast-moving cold chains, this is the hardest thing to pull off. And actually, I think we're quite a long way away from the infrastructure and the structures we need to be able to achieve that kind of thing in the sorts of densely populated European places that we probably think of. Potentially there's more opportunity for that in other parts of the world. But obviously within all of that, across the piece, load optimization is the key, planning out what you need to move and how you move it. And I think there's great potential there, but not so much delivery. When we're talking about buildings then, moving on to the buildings, probably the single biggest innovation that we're seeing around the world is bigger. So just the reality of it is that big cold stores are significantly more efficient than smaller ones. And that's not the case across the board, but generally speaking, cooling a big space that's purpose-built, that's potentially automated, that's operating in the dark with low amounts of human ingress into the space, they tend to be significantly more efficient. And there's greater use and opportunity for automation in that. But as anyone who operates in the temperature-controlled supply chain knows, big only really suits some purposes, and we still need a significant amount of small. And we need to think about how we do that and how we bring some of those automation benefits and efficiencies into our smaller operations as well. Insulation is probably the thing it's really boring stuff, but basically making sure your building doesn't have holes in it and there isn't heat and cold escaping from the building is a fundamental challenge in driving decarbonisation of the cold chain. So it's about design and specification of buildings. It's about buying the right sorts of materials. It's about monitoring and being sophisticated in how you monitor the thermal performance of your building. And it's about consistent repair and maintenance. Well, we have a member in a very good, very efficient business in Poland in the GCCA, and they have a strategy which is called shut the, and I won't say the word, door. But basically it's true. People in cold stores need to keep the door shut in order to avoid using too much energy. And that is basically the fund. It's as simple as that, and there's a lot of loss of commissions because we're not managing or using the buildings properly. And then obviously there are systems themselves. And there's a lot of innovation opportunity in this and a lot of debate about the pros and cons of different systems. But really, what we're talking about in refrigeration is about constant incremental improvement. So a refrigeration system bought today would generally speaking be significantly more, 2 or 3 times more efficient than it was 10 years ago. But again, design is key because it's not about the equipment itself, it's about how the system is built for the purpose that is required. Obviously, we've got the whole issue around F-gas and the drive for and the need to basically think about natural refrigerants as a solution in all cases for the long term. And in some applications, that's tough. And obviously, that monitoring and data, that ongoing monitoring of inputs in the system, getting it right first time. So yes, innovation, buildings, transport, lots and lots of opportunity for inventors across the piece to really help with this drive. But really, and this is where I'm preaching to the choir with Tim and his colleagues in the Centre for Sustainable Cooling, really what we're talking about here is systems. We need to think about the system that is the cold chain and how the different things have dependencies and work together. And let's start, I'm going to talk about three types. The first system is the energy system, and I had some fascinating conversation this morning that opened my mind to the agricultural dimensions in this. But really, as we look to the future, a large cold store essentially is a large battery. It's a thermal product where you're putting in a lot of cold energy, and then you are managing your inputs and out and whatever else, and that has a battery effect on the draw it puts on the grid. So we already have a quite sophisticated system in the UK, for example, where cold stores are switched off when there is a demand surge on the grid in order to create that kind of demand response. We need to be thinking about that both in terms of how we manage peak demand, but also what we do when we have a surplus of energy. Can we bring more energy into cold stores when there is a surplus of renewable energy on the grid? Can we bring that in and just cool these things down colder? How about, obviously, industrial warehouses have got a lot of opportunity to be a place where you can generate energy, whether it's solar panel on their roofs or it's anaerobic digestion, co-location of goods. And that dynamic relationship between the energy we need and the energy we generate has to be a key part of the future, very much like the presentation we had this morning. And so understanding how and then throwing the dimension of the electrification and the alternative powering of our vehicles, that has another dynamic within that as well. So we have to think about the system that is that is the cold chain within the wider energy system. And I would predict that if we project forward 10, 15 years, what's going to be different about cold chain businesses is that they're going to be energy managers in a way that energy sellers and energy retailers, a big part, a cost center, a profit center, a competitive advantage point of that business in the future will be how it manages, generates, and uses energy, and how it sells that energy potentially to other users. The other system that we need to think about is particularly about road miles, particularly in the busier, sort of denser urban environments that are growing around the world. We've got to be thinking about how we drive more efficiency through the number of vehicles that are doing the same job on the same roads, delivering to the same places. How can we consolidate that number of different purposes going into our towns and cities, and how do we reduce the radials on distribution? Easy to draw on a piece of paper, incredibly hard to achieve in practice, but nonetheless, it is absolutely the future of our cold chain distribution systems. And again, we have to think differently about the system and the purpose and the objective of our job as much as we do about the technologies we're using to do it. And then finally, the one that's I'm going to be talking about most when I'm in Dubai next week is this issue of what about some of the fundamentals, what about some of the holy grails of cold chain? Frozen means minus 18 degrees centigrade or 0 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the temperature. That is the global definition of frozen for frozen food in particular. But no one really knows why, other than it's a right round number. And there are actually lots of suggestions that temperature is not necessarily the right one or at least we're over chilling. We're keeping stuff too cold because of that regulatory and kind of custom and practice. The reason it's that number is because we know it's safe. We know it's the right. We know that the supply chain working to that benchmark works well. And because we know that as we walk our way through the supply chain, there is that kind of sort of like heart attack style approach to how goods might be handled in the transition points. Therefore, we have to go to a lower point baseline in order to manage that transition. If we're able, through the links in the chain, to reduce that heart attack or that to a more healthy heart rate, shall we say, then potentially we can save a huge amount of energy. And there's a report that's about to be published, and probably breaking an embargo or something, but I apologize, that shows that if we were able to change the sort of average customer practice from a minus 18 benchmark to a minus 15 benchmark, we would save 10% of the energy we use in the cold chain. And that's not about new technology, new equipment. It's not about new buildings or anything like that. It's about having a better way of handling the product and monitoring the product as it moves through the chain. That's simply said, it's a simple high concept. It's really hard to achieve in practice, not least because we're talking about a number of different disparate actors that have to collaborate in ways they're not used to doing. So how will all this happen then? And I think, my job and the Global Cold Chains Alliance job is not really to stand here and tell you what the right innovation to back today is for tomorrow and what's the technology landscape going to look like, because we don't know. Lots of people in this room will have a better understanding of that than me. What we are about, though, is how do we get the business, how do we get the people that ultimately run the systems, who decide what to buy, who decide what to invest in, to think about this stuff and to drive the change, or to be the change, or whatever the right phraseology is. And we have to think about those different drivers and how we drive those. So whether it's competition and invention, whether it's the leadership of governments, either nationally, regionally, internationally, whether it's the rising cost base and those sort of push factors around finding ways to show a saving or a business case. Of course, the issues around regulation. There's regulation that's the answer. In some places, regulation is the answer, or it's the unavoidable driver of change. It could be about consumer demand. And actually, I think this is one where I ultimately would go back to. Yes, governments seem to prevaricate. Yes, there's a fluctuation in the general mood that we're reading on X or in the media. But the fundamental consumer demand is only going in one direction. And I think that's probably one of the North Stars we should have when we think about this. And also our employees, and I think we had that, it was a really good discussion earlier. The employees who, of today and tomorrow, want to work for companies that are seeing this as a challenge they are owning and wanting to take forward. And we also think about the money and the investment. Actually, one of the things about cold chain industrial assets is they are big investment vehicles, and the global investment markets are looking for certain values in what they're investing in. And of course, the reality of that is those are all drivers. I'm interested in anyone's thoughts or views on these different drivers and which ones to focus on. But the reality is all of those things are the pressures that we have to be thinking about and driving and helping to move along if we're going to see the change we want to see in the decarbonisation of our supply chains. So to conclude then, no one innovation or technological breakthrough will deliver the decarbonisation of the food supply chain demands. It's about the systems, and it's about the people, it's about the long-term objectives and staying the course through the fluctuating nature of time. This image here is sort of referring in here at the end because it's from Professor Alan McKinnon. If you want to sort of illustrate the kind of the system over as a whole of how we decarbonise logistics, we've got to think about that sort of wheel of reducing the carbon content of the energy that we need, reducing the amount of freight we move, shifting freight from dirtier or higher emission modes to less so, optimizing the utilization of the vehicles we do have and that we're using, and increasing the energy efficiency of everything that we do use. So across working any business that wants to run a decarbonisation strategy or a sustainability strategy for its logistics needs to look at that wheel and pick its initiatives from across those 5 things. I'm literally in like day 1 or day -5 actually of being at the Global Cold Chain Alliance, and there's a huge amount of opportunity and excitement here, and I'm very excited about being part of this transition. And it's only through the cross-fertilization of ideas, the innovation of ideas that are coming out in other sectors, and the conversations like the one we're having today that will help us to make a difference. So thank you all very much.